At 57, Frank Thomas, the legend known as the Big Hurt, sits quietly in a house so vast that even the wind echoes like voices from the past. On the wall behind him hang the legacies that once made all of America bow in respect: two gleaming MVP trophies under warm yellow light, the 2014 Hall of Fame plaque, the retired number 35 jersey from the Chicago White Sox, and footage of the 521 home runs that once tore across the American sky. Frank wasn't just a slugger, he was a mountain of muscle, a storm of power, the very soul of the White Sox throughout the 1990s and 2000s. While many superstars of his era got swept up in the steroid age, he stood alone, proud and clean, defying an entire dirty era with nothing but the raw strength of his body and a discipline sharp as a blade no one in MLB had a longer streak of. 300, 100 RBI, 100 runs, 100 walks, 20-hour seasons. No one was both an offensive machine and a stronger moral symbol. Frank Thomas wasn't just great on the field, he became Chicago's pride, a living chapter of American baseball history. But behind that dazzling glory lies a reality few ever touch. At 57, the body that once terrified an entire league now betrays its owner, knees swollen like water balloons every morning, joints cracking like breaking metal, a back so painful that even bending over forces him to squeeze his eyes shut in endurance. On TV, old highlights play like distant ghosts. Frank watches, and his eyes redden, not from pride, but because they remind him of what he lost: youth, the grass, the roar of the crowd, teammates who have one by one passed away or faded with time. Behind the muscle and pride lie decades of unseen pain, the haunting loss of his little sister in childhood, a broken marriage that left him sitting alone many nights in a pitch-dark living room, the emptiness of watching the White Sox win it all in 2005 on a screen, because injury crushed his dream of being there. That colossal career was built on extraordinary effort, but it came with sacrifice, loneliness, and wounds only he truly understands. Frank Thomas's tragedy isn't a sudden explosion in front of the world, it's quiet, silent, slowly squeezing the strongest heart in MLB day after day, and then in that empty house, he realizes that the home runs that once flew over 450 feet never defeated the thing that hurts him most: time, memory, and the loneliness of a man who lived too many years in the spotlight, only to learn how to survive in the dark. If you want to continue the journey full of pain and resilience of the legend Frank Thomas, please subscribe so you don't miss the next part. And if this story touches you, leave a like as a tribute to a man who walked through darkness to stand firm in the light. Turning to the early pages of Frank Thomas's life, it's easy to believe a sports legend must be born into light, luck, or at least a complete family. But Frank's journey began in the exact opposite place. He was born into a poor working-class family in Columbus, Georgia, where his parents worked themselves to exhaustion every day just to bring a little food home, where the evening sighs were as familiar as the ticking of a clock. His father was a quiet, stoic man, whose eyes carried the weariness of a lifetime of struggle. His mother, resilient like many Southern women of that era, shouldered responsibilities so heavy that even a smile became a luxury. In that home, love was never lacking, but time to show it was always too scarce. The Thomas family's life grew even heavier when Frank's little sister Pamela developed leukemia. Frank was just a boy then, but his world suddenly changed color. The carefree afternoons playing in the front yard vanished, replaced by long drives to the hospital, cold white lights, the smell of antiseptic seeping into every strand of hair and fold of clothing. Young Frank stood by her bedside, watching his sister grow weaker day by day, her once bright eyes sinking into exhaustion. He couldn't understand why heaven had chosen Pamela, the kindest child in the house, for such a cruel curse. But what Frank understood perfectly was his own helplessness. Some nights he woke to the sound of her painful coughing, ran to his mother's room, then froze at the sight of her sitting on the floor, face buried in her hands, crying in silence. Frank didn't know what to do. He wasn't old enough to save his sister, but old enough to feel his family slowly cracking like fractured glass. And then the fateful day came. Pamela passed away, leaving the house shrouded in a darkness as heavy as stone on everyone's chest. His mother collapsed in grief, while his father did what many men of that time did, swallowed the pain in silence. No one spoke of Pamela, but the silence said everything. Frank, standing in the small room where his sister's bed once stood, felt as if he had abandoned her. In his young heart, the pain became a red-hot metal block, burning fiercely while searing his flesh. The boy promised himself he would be strong in her place, live bigger, fight harder. But the price of that silent vow was a childhood strangled by responsibility and obsession. Frank never forgot the hospital corridor's medicinal smell, the steady beep of the IV pump, and above all the choked sound from his mother, the crying that never became words because she feared her children seeing it. He carried those memories like a shadow that never left his side. The pain of losing his sister wasn't just an event, it was the axis that shaped his entire life. It explains why Frank always had a more thoughtful gaze than others, why he trained tirelessly, why he rarely celebrated wildly even after the most crucial home runs. Frank grew up believing happiness was fragile, something that could be taken away at any moment. When people saw the extraordinary power of an MLB star, Frank saw in himself a little boy standing in the hospital darkness, holding his sister's hand and praying for a miracle that never came. Perhaps that's why Frank Thomas became Frank Thomas, the man who never allowed himself weakness, never gave up, and never truly healed. Those earliest wounds didn't disappear when he became a legend. They were simply hidden under stadium lights, and when the lights went out, the darkness returned as intact as the day he first knew pain. Losing Pamela didn't just take a piece of the Thomas family's soul, it stole Frank's childhood. After her death, the boy who had once been as carefree as a southern breeze suddenly became quiet and heavy, like a shadow with nowhere to cling. Frank grew up physically powerful, that's what everyone saw, a kid taller and broader than his peers, shoulders wide as if destined to carry the world. But that same body set him apart, drew curious and sometimes mocking stares. "That kid's built like an ox, but runs like a turtle," one child said behind his back. "Not cut out for pro sports," a coach remarked, never knowing those words didn't fall into empty air, but landed straight in Frank's already cracked heart. Despite looking like a boy who couldn't be hurt, Frank had an extremely sensitive soul. He felt adults' gazes more sharply than anyone, those skeptical looks, polite nods, laced with prejudice. On the schoolyard, Frank stood in the crowd yet felt alone, as if an invisible glass wall separated him from the world. He saw himself as oversized yet unnecessary, strong yet treated like something out of place. No one understood that Frank threw himself into sports not to prove his strength, but to escape the pain gnawing at him from inside. After Pamela's death, he carried an unnamed feeling, guilt, helplessness, and fear that one day whatever he loved would be taken again. While others played ball for fun, Frank played to survive. He ran as if fleeing his mother's crying, threw as if hurling away cold hospital memories, lifted weights as if a stronger body might make his heart hurt less. But no, pain isn't afraid of muscle. It crept into every thought, becoming an invisible voice that followed him through childhood and youth. "You're not good enough. You're too slow. You'll let people down again. You'll lose everything again." Those words weren't spoken directly to him. They were pieced together from life's sounds, from small but cutting remarks, from the pain Pamela left behind. Young Frank was trapped between two worlds, the outside one that saw him as an oversized kid lacking agility, and the inner one where guilt and sadness always lurked to drag him down. Yet that very isolation made Frank different. While other kids finished practice and ran home for dinner, Frank stayed on the field for hours more. When friends grew tired and quit, Frank clenched his fists until they turned white to push one more rep, run one more lap. He didn't train to get picked. He trained because he needed to feel something in life was still under his control. The more he was underestimated, the more Frank pushed himself to an almost obsessive level of grind. On summer afternoons hitting 104 degrees, sweat pouring like rain onto the field, Frank kept sprinting, his big feet pounding the ground as if trying to shatter every limit others placed on him. He didn't train to stand out, he trained so he wouldn't collapse. But that effort wasn't always understood. Many only saw a big, strong kid and never knew that inside was a child who felt tiny, always afraid of others' eyes, always afraid of disappointing someone again. Frank had no Pamela to whisper to at night, didn't dare tell his parents for fear of worrying them more, so he talked to his own shadow. You can do it, don't lose, don't fall. In that loneliness, Frank began forging the steel will that MLB would later respect. But the cost was a childhood without innocence, emotions suppressed until numb, and a fear of failure scarred deep and unhealed. Frank didn't grow up like a kid becoming an athlete. He grew up like a kid trying to survive painful memories and the world's judgment. And in that darkness, his resilience quietly took shape, a strength that came not from joy, but from pain. People often say legends are made from light. But for Frank Thomas, his legend was born from long, gloomy days when that big boy had to quietly battle himself in silence. Loneliness killed his childhood, but it also forged the steel heart that America would later call by two words, the Big Hurt. Frank's teenage years passed with endless afternoons, running relentlessly under Georgia's scorching sun, evenings so exhausting that even sadness fell asleep in his heavy chest. The strength he forged with tears and loneliness began to attract coaches' attention. When Frank stepped into Auburn University, those who once saw him as the too big, too slow kid suddenly had to take a second look. At Auburn, Frank didn't just stand out, he exploded. On the football field, he was as powerful as a beast, a wall of flesh moving at unbelievable speed. Coaches said that if Frank fully committed to the NFL, he would become one of the most dangerous tight ends in the American South. Local press began mentioning his name. Fans looked at him with admiration. For the first time in his life, Frank felt the world opening up instead of closing in on him. The NFL dream came to him like the first light after years in darkness. Frank began to believe this was the path fate had chosen for him, the path that could help him escape hospital memories, escape the obsession that he was not good enough, escape the feeling of being undervalued by the whole world. He started envisioning himself running on an NFL field, the stands roaring, teammates hugging him after every touchdown. It wasn't the dream of an athlete, but the dream of a once-hurt child desperately trying to prove his own worth. Frank never said it out loud, but in his heart the NFL wasn't just a career, it was the door to his own forgiveness. But then the NFL draft day arrived, the day that changes the lives of hundreds of young men forever. The day Frank believed he would finally hear his name called on national TV. He sat in the dorm room, an old TV on the rickety table, blue light flickering on his face full of hope. A few friends gathered, waiting, chatting. Frank tried to act calm, but inside, his heart pounded like it wanted to burst from his chest. He had sacrificed too much to get here. Round 1 passed, no name. Round 2, no. Round 3, round 4, still no. Friends' names were called. Guys worse than him. Guys not as strong, not as fast. Frank smiled and congratulated them, but his eyes began to darken. The room gradually emptied. Only the TV's steady draft commentary remained, like a dull knife sharp enough to slice into his self-respect. By the final round, Frank wasn't sitting straight anymore. He slumped over, hands clutching his head, trying to hear just one more time, just once, his name called. But it never came. The final silence rang so loud that Frank thought he could hear his heart drop to the floor. The NFL didn't choose him, not one team. In that moment, Frank felt like fate had lifted him to the peak of hope, only to push him into the abyss of despair. He felt betrayed by destiny, by life, by the fragile belief he had allowed himself to nurture. You're not good enough. That familiar voice echoed in his head again. It was like Pamela dying all over again. Like every childhood pain being dragged back, crushing him with the same old wounds he thought he had buried under sprints, weight lifts, ball touches. Frank turned off the TV. The room fell so silent, he could hear his own trembling breath. Friends had left to celebrate their new futures. Frank stayed alone, on the creaky wooden chair, his big hands shaking with anger, sadness, overwhelming humiliation. He didn't cry, but tears welled right at the edge of his eyelids. In that moment, he thought all his years of effort were meaningless. He hadn't saved his sister, he hadn't been valued in school, and now he wasn't considered good enough for the NFL, the dream he believed he deserved. Fate seemed to mock him, as if saying you can be strong but you'll never win. But fate, with its mysterious cruelty, sometimes crushes us just to see what we'll do next. And Frank Thomas, the man with a heart full of wounds but a will like steel forged in fire, didn't choose to give up. In the days that followed, while disappointment still burned hot in his chest, Frank turned to the baseball field more. Baseball had been a side sport for him, just a small joy beside the dazzling NFL dream. But now, with that dream stripped away, baseball became the only refuge left. On Auburn's red dirt field, Frank stood alone, gripping the heavy wooden bat. Each swing was a way to vent his rage at life. Each crack of bat on ball was a declaration of war against the fate that had turned its back on him. And it was from that dark moment, from the collapse that seemed impossible to rise from, that Frank Thomas began stepping onto the path that would later make the whole world call him by two words of respect: a legend. The NFL rejected him, but baseball chose him. And destiny, in a way both cruel and beautiful, led Frank to where he belonged. In the days after the NFL fall, Frank Thomas lived like someone walking through the ashes of his own life. He no longer saw the world through the naive, hopeful eyes of a young man, but through the contemplative gaze of one who had been brutally knocked down by fate. But in that silence, another door was quietly opening. Baseball, the thing he once saw as just a side pursuit, suddenly became the only lifeline he could cling to. And it was from this place that seemed not destined that Frank began to see a light he had never had the chance to feel throughout his childhood, teenage years, and early adulthood. In 1989, the Chicago White Sox decided to select Frank in the MLB draft. It wasn't a choice hyped by the media. No long analyses of his potential, no praise for a brilliant future. Many experts even expressed doubt. A guy rejected by the NFL, a body too big for MLB standards, lacking traditional baseball technique, could he survive in a league for athletes honed from childhood? Frank heard it all. He remembered every comment falling into his ears like boulders into a lake. But for the first time in his life, instead of feeling smaller, he felt a strange fire igniting. Chicago became the second chance he wouldn't allow himself to lose. He threw himself into training as if each swing was a fight to reclaim the self-respect lost on NFL draft day. White Sox coaches didn't understand why a rookie was so obsessively diligent. They didn't know Frank was hitting not just for points, but to knock out of his mind the familiar voice of darkness: "You're not good enough. You'll fail again." Then the miracle began to happen. When the 1990 season opened, Frank stepped onto the major league field with an eerie calm, as if all the pain in his life had gathered into an unbreakable will. His first swings left the entire White Sox team stunned. The ball flew with a sound heard only from the most veteran hitters, a dry crack like splitting the earth. In a short time, Frank Thomas went from doubted rookie to phenom. But the phenom label quickly became too small for what Frank was about to achieve. He wasn't just good, he was superior. He dominated. He turned every field into a showcase of muscle and mental power. By 1993 and 1994, MLB had to acknowledge no one was better than Frank Thomas. 2 consecutive MVP awards, something nearly impossible, placed his name in the legendary skies of American baseball. And when the White Sox stadium erupted in cheers, when people began calling him the Big Hurt, they thought they were describing the power of his swing, the fear he instilled in pitchers, and the destruction his bat wrought on the ball. But no one knew that the name, the Big Hurt, also spoke of his own heart, a heart once torn by loss, rejection, disdain, a heart ripped by tragedies that all of MLB would never fully know. When his name echoed through the stadium, Frank still felt an invisible distance between himself and the world. He stood there, massive and powerful, making tens of thousands scream his name, yet inside was a cold desert where old memories lingered like shadows he couldn't chase away. Frank once told a teammate, "I hit the ball hard because I carry more wounds than they think." Indeed, during the White Sox winning days, when the whole team celebrated, when Chicago lived in a frenzy of hope and pride, Frank often drove home alone to his apartment. He turned on the lights, the room lit up instantly, but still couldn't dispel the emptiness. He set down his bat, sat on the wooden chair, and just stared into space. No beer, no loud music, no crowd, just silence. A silence that, no matter how many years he'd tried to escape it, always found its way back. as if reminding him that some victories can't fill the voids inside a person. The more successful he became, the lonelier Frank felt. Glory is like a mountain. The higher you climb, the colder the wind. In fans' eyes he was that invincible mountain, but he himself felt the chill seeping through his muscles more than anyone, piercing straight into old wounds that never healed. Sometimes after a great game, the press wrote that he was cold, didn't celebrate big enough, didn't smile like other superstars. They didn't understand that joy, for Frank, always came with the fear of losing it, a fear rooted from the day he lost his sister, from the day the NFL rejected him, from the day he was undervalued just for not fitting the mold of other players. But that very loneliness made Frank someone America could never forget. He didn't need attention. He didn't need flash. He didn't need scandals. He just needed to stand at home plate, grip the bat tight, and release all the pain, anger, and loneliness in his heart into swings that shook the entire league. The big hurt, not just the hurt he inflicted on pitchers, but also the hurt life inflicted on him, yet he still stood firm, still fought, still unyielding. Frank Thomas first saw the light in Chicago, but that light didn't make the darkness disappear. It only made him see the shape of the darkness in his heart more clearly, and learn to keep walking, even when glory itself sometimes made his soul colder than ever. This period, Frank didn't just grow as an athlete, he grew as a person, learning to exist between two extremes, the light of the field and the darkness of the soul. And from that contrast, a legend was born, a legend that, in the loudest echoes of his career, always had something ringing softly, sadly, the heartbeat of the big hurt, never fully healed. Frank Thomas's following seasons were the most glorious days in Chicago White Sox history. He stood in the middle of the field like an angry god, bat gleaming under stadium lights, every swing creating a crack that made the crowd explode. Stats beyond human limits, consistent, 300+, RBIs pouring like a waterfall, home runs so high that pitchers trembled, hearing his name in the lineup. All of America called him an icon, and Chicago saw him as the heart of the city. But few knew that heart never stopped hurting. Glory surrounded him everywhere, but so did loneliness. The greater Frank became on the field, the more estranged he felt from the world outside, partly because of his overly disciplined, focused, serious personality, partly because inner wounds made him unable to open up. While other superstars laughed and partied, appeared at lavish events and easily blended into MLB's glamorous whirl, Frank chose silence. He finished the game, went to the locker room, showered quickly, then quietly left the stadium like a shadow. The media didn't understand that. They didn't see the sensitivity inside that giant man. Didn't see the nights he sat alone in a pitch-black living room, with only the TV on low, as proof he wasn't completely alone. Didn't see the fear of failure still creeping in him, the fear he'd carried since watching his sister pass away. Didn't see Frank always suppressing emotions, because he believed if he allowed weakness for a second, the past would flood back and drown him. Instead, the press wrote, "Frank Thomas is cold. Frank Thomas is arrogant. Frank Thomas is distant from teammates." Those words cut deep into his heart like knives, not because they hurt his image, but because they reminded him of a childhood misunderstood, misjudged, seen as different. Frank never wanted to be distant. He just didn't know how to live any other way. What made that pain deeper was how some teammates viewed him. In the team, everyone acknowledged Frank's talent, but overwhelming talent can be a double-edged sword. His seriousness became a threat to those who were more relaxed. Some said behind his back, "Frank acts like he's carrying the whole team, always so serious, doesn't know how to have fun." Some were annoyed because he rarely partied, rarely drank, rarely acted friendly. Frank heard those things, but he didn't blame them. He just felt more isolated. Every kindness from him, every effort, was viewed with suspicion. The more successful he became, the more out of place he felt, like someone on a mountaintop with no one to share the cold wind. And so when stadium lights blazed brightest, when crowds roared his name, when the world thought Frank Thomas was living every player's dream, Frank sat in his apartment after big games, turning on a small desk lamp, letting emptiness flood in. No matter how high a mountain rises, In the end it's still just a block of stone standing alone. Frank never admitted this to anyone, but he knew full well that glory couldn't fill his inner void. No title compensated for the childhood left behind. No home run erased memories of Pamela. No win healed the gash in his self-respect from the day the NFL rejected him. And over time, Frank told himself, "I grew up with pain. Maybe I only know how to live with it." That wasn't the words of someone desperate, but of someone who'd lived long enough in darkness to accept it as part of himself. For Frank, pain was like a shadow. It could fade, stretch, change shape, but never vanish. The more he stood in the light, the clearer he saw the shadow behind him. Baseball gave Frank fame, money, respect, but baseball also took his peace. The pressure to maintain extraordinary performance meant he never dared relax. While others saw success as achievement, Frank saw it as a reminder he couldn't step back. While teammates could fail one day and bounce back the next, Frank didn't dare fail, because he believed if he fell, everything would collapse, like the night Pamela died, like the day the NFL draft abandoned him. So every game, every at-bat, every swing carried the weight of a lifetime of fighting. But one thing Frank couldn't escape: no matter how many home runs he hit, how many times he circled the diamond, he still carried that lonely man inside. And that loneliness, not loud like scandals, not brilliant like victories, was the most enduring tragedy of his life. Frank Thomas was a warrior born from suffering, but warriors have hearts too, and that heart, through his peak MLB years, still beat to the same rhythm, the rhythm of a boy who lost his sister, was rejected, mocked, misunderstood. A boy who just wanted to be seen, understood, loved, but ended up the strongest man on the field, with a shattered heart the world thought didn't exist. The years Frank stood at MLB's peak were also when American baseball fell into its darkest era, the steroid era, a time when 500-foot home runs no longer came from effort or talent, but from needles, muscle-boosting drugs, things that turned human bodies into something half real, half fake, half genius, half lab product. While media praised baseball's revival, Frank saw the opposite: rot spreading from the gym to the diamond. He watched friends beside him suddenly bulk up like they were inflated. He saw arms once soft now veined and unnaturally swollen, bodies shattering biological limits, players who'd trailed him now surpassing him after one off-season. He saw swings powered by artificial muscle, not real heart. He saw the game he loved since childhood turning into a contest, not of talent, but of illegal doses. And then he saw the hardest thing to accept: the very people cheating were the ones being celebrated, paid huge salaries, put on magazine covers, while he, the one doing it right, the one holding principles, was told he was not explosive enough, not keeping up with the times, no longer fitting the modern MLB star image. Glory turned into a burden, integrity into a sin, morality into something that isolated him. Frank never spoke out, but he knew the moment he felt out of step with the world was when he first saw those unreal bodies in the gym. He didn't know what they were using, but he knew they couldn't get those physiques in just a few months. He knew something was wrong, something that didn't belong in the baseball he loved, but when he tried to speak up, many mocked him. Some said straight to his face, "Big hurt, more like big virgin." Others sneered, "He's just jealous because others are passing him." Some players joked in the locker room, "Thomas is too moral, probably thinks he's better than everyone." Those words hit his deepest pain, the pain of being misunderstood. From childhood on, Frank had always been misjudged for his appearance, his silence, his seriousness. Now in MLB, he became a target of ridicule for the one thing he always preserved: his cleanliness. A clean man in a dirty world. A true heart in an era full of fakes. A lone warrior on a battlefield full of steroid ghosts. It wasn't just athletic loneliness. It was a moral tragedy. The kind Simon Cowell once endured for telling the truth and being hated for it. The only difference was that for Frank, that loneliness dragged on day by day, week by week, season by season. Frank watched his rivals, men of his generation, surpass him in stats, break records he'd taken years of grinding to achieve. But they didn't use effort, they used needles. One injection was enough to turn an ordinary man into a Superman. But for Frank, there were no shortcuts. Never. He still woke up at 5 a.m., still ate strictly like a sports monk, still trained through pain until his knees swelled so badly some days he could barely walk, still believed only things earned through sweat were truly worth it. MLB back then was like a wild circus stage, where the unnatural became normal. But Frank Thomas, the man who refused fakery, became out of touch in his own era. Loneliness became his constant companion. Some days after games, he'd walk into the locker room and feel condescending glances from a few teammates, guys who'd deliberately lift heavy weights in front of him, as if proving they were stronger, faster, better. But Frank knew the truth. They were only stronger because they dared sell their souls for those needles. Some nights Frank drove home in silence, pulled into the parking lot, turned off the engine but didn't get out. He'd sit there, gripping the steering wheel, outside the bustling Chicago streets, inside a heart choked by the feeling of betrayal from the very sport he loved most. He asked himself the question no strong man wants to ask. I'm doing the right thing, but why does doing the right thing hurt so much? That's the question only those who hold principles in a fake era truly understand. But Frank didn't change, not because he wanted to be a hero, but because he didn't know how to live any other way. He didn't know how to betray himself. Frank's honesty wasn't a choice, it was his nature, a nature forged from his sister's death, from a deprived childhood, from years of being undervalued. Frank couldn't cheat, because he knew he'd spent his whole life proving he was worthy. And then MLB had to face the truth. Scandals exploded, big names exposed, numbers questioned, paper statues began to crumble. In the chaos, people looked back at Frank, the only one in his generation who stayed clean, the only one who didn't need drugs to become a legend, the only one who didn't lie to the game he'd given his youth to. In the end, America understood that in a dirty era, a clean man is always the one isolated, but also the only one truly deserving of respect. Frank hadn't just fought opponents, he'd fought a rotten system, and he won, not with the hardest swing, but with the strongest heart. That was the victory few saw, few understood, but his greatest in life, because he knew a man who can't hold his integrity, can't hold anything. And in the needle-dominated MLB era, Frank Thomas stood alone, lonely but proud, like a shining sword in the dark, a light no steroid dose could create. As the doping scandals kept erupting, and all of MLB fell into chaos, Frank Thomas, the man standing alone in his integrity, kept playing ball like a silent warrior. But beyond the stadium lights, another war, quieter, crueler, was slowly crushing his heart. A war no fans saw, no paper mentioned, no teammate understood. It was the war with the breakdown in the very family he'd tried to protect. Frank loved deeply. That was the softest, most fragile part of the man America called the Big Hurt. When he loved the way he lived, all in full force, no half measures. But the MLB career, constant flights, cities changing weekly, endless draining practices, games stretching into midnight, swallowed the little time he had. And love, no matter how strong, still needs presence. Something Frank could almost never give enough. In the late 1990s, as his career hit its peak, his marriage slowly hit rock bottom. Not from infidelity, not from scandal, not from clashing personalities, but from quiet distance, building up bit by bit. The distance of dinners Frank couldn't attend, the distance of family events he missed, the distance of sorrows his wife had to bear alone in silence, because Frank was in another city, hitting another home run. Frank always thought his success protected his family. That money, fame, and stability made up for the nights he wasn't home. But he didn't realize sometimes people don't need a legend, they just need a husband. In 2001, Frank's marriage fell apart. No yelling, no media scandal, no blame statements, just silence, cold and painful, the kind of pain unlike the physical pain he was used to. It was the kind that made him feel he'd lost the last soft piece left in his heart. His career took him to the top, but his career also took away what made him happiest. Frank once admitted in a rare interview, his voice dropping as if every word weighed heavy, "Success didn't help me keep what made me happy. It wasn't the words of someone regretful, it was the words of someone who understood he'd traded too much and couldn't go back. On those glorious MLB nights, when crowds roared his name, when fireworks exploded over the stadium, Frank clearly felt two opposing worlds inside him, one world blazing with light, where he was the hero, and another world, dark, vast, cold like the emptiness in a home where laughter was no longer heard. Many thought divorce was normal for athletes. They thought Frank, a star, a legend, would get over it quickly. But the truth was nothing like that. Divorce broke Frank in a way only those who felt loneliness amid success could understand. He'd come home to his apartment after games, turn on the lights, and face the void. No one asking how he played today. No one waiting for him. No one sitting with him for a silent dinner. No one touching his shoulder when he was tired. The house became too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you hear every lonely heartbeat in your chest. One night, after a great game, Frank drove home with the crowd's cheers still echoing like waves. But when the door closed behind him, he felt like he'd stepped into a deep well. He sat down, looked at his baseball cleats, and saw them lying next to the empty chair of someone who once waited for him. Frank understood he'd lost something far more important than glory. MLB could etch his name in history. Chicago could retire his jersey forever. Fans could love him with passionate hearts. But none of that could replace the feeling of being loved by someone for being Frank, not the Big Hurt, not the MVP, not the baseball superstar, just Frank. Divorce didn't just make him sad, it made him remember everything he'd lost in life: his sister, his childhood, his NFL dream, and now his family. A man who could hit a ball 450 feet, but no swing strong enough to knock away the growing loneliness inside. And when Frank looked in the mirror after the divorce, he realized a painful truth. He no longer knew what happiness felt like. Under stadium lights, Frank was a monument. But in the darkness of his post-divorce home, he was just a cracking heart, so silent, no one heard it shatter. Divorce carved a deep crack in Frank's heart, but he didn't know life still had another tragedy in store, one crueler, fiercer, and perhaps the heaviest blow he'd ever take. It didn't just hurt his body, it crushed his soul. In 2004, at age 36, Frank Thomas was still the soul of the Chicago White Sox. His body had endured years of MLB pressure, but his will stood firm like cooled steel. He believed he still had many great seasons ahead, a glorious final chapter to prove. The Big Hurt hadn't faded. Then fate stepped in. A routine base-running play, something he'd done a million times in his career, suddenly became the moment his whole world collapsed. As he planted his foot, a dry crack rang out. That sound didn't just tear through the bones in his left foot. It tore away the last fragile piece of peace in his heart. Frank collapsed to the ground, clutching his foot, face pale. The pain wasn't just pain. It was a hot knife, stabbing to the marrow. Teammates rushed over. The crowd fell silent. The entire stadium held its breath as the strongest, most dangerous, proudest man on the team lay motionless like a felled tree. He tried to stand, couldn't. He tried to lean on crutches, couldn't. And as doctors ran onto the field, Frank knew in that instant his life was about to change. Fractured bones, torn ligaments, structural foot damage, cold medical terms read out like a death sentence. Surgery, metal plates, and no one daring to guarantee he'd play again. Frank sat in the hospital room, leg immobilized, eyes staring at the glaring white ceiling. He thought of Pamela. He thought of the NFL draft. He thought of the divorce. All the old pains returned, merging into a massive storm inside him. One question drilled into his mind: if I no longer have baseball, what do I have left? The fear of uselessness, the thing he'd spent his life running from, now stood before him like a mocking ghost. The months that followed were pure hell. Frank rehabbed in pain so intense, he sometimes screamed. Some days his foot swelled so much he couldn't put it on the floor. Some mornings he woke with tears streaming just from the throbbing like a hammer on bone. The Big Hurt, who once crushed pitchers with thunderous swings, now lay there, unable to walk, unable to tie his own shoes, unable to run, unable to swing. Physical pain was only part of it. The greatest pain was feeling his career, the thing he loved more than himself, being taken away. 2005 came, and the White Sox prepared to explode in a way no one expected. Strong lineup, high spirits, Chicago's expectations rising like a tide. Frank was still tormented by injury, but he believed that when the team reached the playoffs, he'd have a chance to return, at least as a small miracle. Then the White Sox advanced through each round. Chicago shook. A city waiting nearly 90 years for a World Series title suddenly saw hope ignite. But Frank Thomas, the team's biggest icon, had to sit out. He tried to appear strong for his teammates, but inside, every White Sox win was another knife twist in his heart. Then the fateful day arrived. The Chicago White Sox won the 2005 World Series, a historic victory. A day every Chicago baseball fan would remember for life. A day that should have had Frank standing on the highest podium, but it didn't. Amid the wild celebrations, fireworks blazing in the sky, champagne flowing on the field, Frank Thomas sat alone in his living room, left foot propped on a chair, wrapped in ice. The TV screen showing teammates hugging in joy, scenes of names who'd stood beside him, now hoisting the trophy, scenes of the White Sox, the team he'd poured his heart into leading, entering history without him. Frank sat motionless, not speaking, not moving. Then tears fell, not from envy, not from jealousy, but because he felt life had abandoned him right when he needed it most. Those tears were the tears of 30 years of fighting, and still being robbed of the final moment of glory. People look at history and see the White Sox winning it all, but they don't see Frank Thomas, a legend, sitting in the dark with a heart more broken than his fractured bones. That was Frank's breaking point. Like the bike accident that nearly killed Simon Cowell, the 2004-2005 injury nearly killed who Frank was. It was the kind of tragedy that turns a man into a shadow of himself, the kind of blow that made him understand no title, no MVP, no home run guarantees life will be fair. After that night, Frank's room became quiet as a grave. No more cheers, no more stadium lights, just him and pain no one could see. And when the TV screen went dark, Frank understood his career had just been robbed of something he could never get back. The final moment he deserved to live. 2004, 2005, wasn't just the darkest year of his life. It was the year that broke him and forced him to learn how to rise from his own shards. After the night the White Sox hoisted the World Series trophy without him, Frank Thomas entered 2006 like a shadow of himself. Fans remembered him. Chicago still called him a legend, but inside Frank knew what killed him wasn't the injury, but the feeling of being left behind at the exact moment he'd spent his whole life chasing. It was like watching the door to his dream open and close at the same time, only the person walking through wasn't him. His body was worn down, his left foot still aching like someone twisting metal into bone every time he tried to move faster. Mornings he had to drag himself out of bed with a limp, knees swollen like two water-filled balls. Many nights he lay awake as pain shot from the sole of his foot up to his hip, like electricity twisting every nerve. All of baseball looked at him and whispered, "He's done. Time to hang it up. He's 37. What's left to prove?" But Frank Thomas had never been one to surrender. Not when his sister collapsed on her hospital bed, not when the NFL rejected him, not when his marriage fell apart, not when injury crushed his foot. A part of him, the steel forged from a lifetime of endurance, wouldn't let him leave the field like someone fate had kicked aside. So he did what no one expected. He left Chicago, left the city that saw him as its son, left the team he'd given his heart and body to, and he went to the Oakland Athletics, a smaller team, less noticed, where no one expected miracles at age 38. But Frank didn't go to coast through his final seasons. He went to come back to life. Oakland 2006 was the greatest comeback any athlete has ever made in the late stage of their career. Frank Thomas, the man all of MLB thought was dead, suddenly returned like a phoenix from the ashes. The day he stepped onto the field in the green and gold of the A's, many only saw an aging body, walking with a slight limp, left foot wrapped in tape as a reminder that time had already marked his exit. But when Frank stepped into the batter's box, something changed. No more fear, no more self-pity, just pure determination, the kind only those who've hit absolute rock bottom can have. And then, He hit. Hit like a man with nothing left to lose. Hit as if every swing was a declaration of war on fate. Hit until all of Oakland exploded. Frank ended the season with 39 home runs, 114 RBIs, numbers few young players could reach, let alone a near 40-year-old with a once shattered foot. He carried Oakland into the playoffs, became the heart and soul of the team, making fans wonder if they were witnessing the final miracle in a legend's career. But Frank knew the truth. His body was marked by time. There was no miracle, just pain. Every swing made his back sting. Every run made his knees swell more. Every morning he woke up, before he could stand straight, he had to sit for 10 minutes to let his joints warm up like an old machine needing a touch to start. Frank later shared that some nights the pain was so bad, he had to brace against the wall to walk to the bathroom, that some days he stepped onto the field with his foot almost completely numb, that there were moments he just wanted to quit, but the pain from 2005 was too great to let himself disappear quietly. The Oakland comeback wasn't just athletic revival, it was the act of a man refusing to be defined by tragedy. Oakland 2006 didn't make Frank young again, it only showed the world the will he'd carried since childhood, the will of the boy running from pain, the young man abandoned by the NFL, the man who lost his family, the legend who nearly lost his career. But Frank knew, this was the final chapter. He felt time like an invisible hand slowing every step, felt fatigue seeping deep into his muscles even as he hit it with a strong smile, felt the shadow of the end standing right behind him. His comeback, no matter how brilliant, couldn't reverse the harsh laws of sports. The dream of forever was dead. But Frank wasn't sad about that. He had come back, not to beat others, but to beat himself, to prove life could take everything from him, but not his will to stand one last time. 2006 was his final farewell to baseball, epic, painful, and beautiful, in the way only warriors who've lived their whole lives in storms can understand. Frank Thomas didn't just play his last season, he lived it like a manifesto, a statement that even if the dream dies, the man carrying it can still rise and shine one last time before darkness falls. When the final season ended, when the cheers faded, when the stadium returned to its natural quiet, Frank Thomas entered the chapter. No player is ever fully prepared for the chapter of silence. No more practice schedules, no more lights shining in his face, no more crowd roaring like a storm, no more adrenaline to forget the pain, just a deep void he had to stare straight into. For many, retirement is a reward. For Frank it felt like a sentence. His body, which had held on for so long, now began to collapse in the cruelest way. He gained weight quickly, as if the years of iron discipline had let go, and his body rushed into a state of revenge. Every morning Frank got out of bed like stepping on broken glass, his left foot burning as if on fire, knees stiff like unoiled metal joints, back hurting so much he had to brace his hands on the bed edge just to stand straight. Injuries were no longer hidden under the adrenaline of competition. They showed clearly, raw, stinging like cold metal on flesh, and the most painful thing, he knew he no longer had the field to vent his anger on them. Without baseball, Frank began to feel the cruelty of time more clearly. Every time he bent down with difficulty to tie his shoes, he remembered his 25-year-old self, agile, powerful, invincible. Every time he turned to the mirror and saw a heavier body, slumped shoulders, more gray hair, he felt like looking at a different version of himself, a version he was never ready to face. Baseball wasn't just a job, it was his identity. It was the only home he knew how to belong to. Without it, Frank felt erased from the world's map. Teammates, those who'd hugged him after wins, slapped his back in the locker room, gradually vanished from his life. They moved into their own lives, own families, own paths. A few called at first, then less often, then disappeared as if they only existed in the seasons when lights shone on them. That's the brutal truth no one tells athletes. When the lights go out, you don't just lose your career, you lose the community, the family, the reason to exist. Frank had experienced loneliness throughout childhood, but post-retirement loneliness was even crueler. Unlike the loneliness of a misunderstood child, this was the loneliness of a forgotten legend. Some afternoons, Frank sat in the living room, TV on but muted, just for a little light to ease the emptiness. On the table was his old glove from the 90s. He touched it, felt the familiarity, but it no longer belonged to him. Every baseball item in the house was like a cruel reminder. You were once great, now what? Worst was the feeling of uselessness, a feeling he thought he'd buried after the NFL draft, but it came back, stronger, deeper, like an old beast waiting for the right moment to bite his heart. Frank was no longer needed every day, no longer thought of every week, no longer mentioned in stadiums. He had to learn to live in the terrifying silence that only those who've stood under blazing lights truly understand. Many nights he lay in bed, staring at the pitch-black ceiling, feeling like falling into a bottomless well. He heard the clock ticking, heard his own heavy breathing, heard his back creak every time he turned. And worst, he heard the old whisper of memories. You have nothing left, no more baseball, no more light. Some days he turned on the TV to watch his old highlights. Home runs so powerful pitchers couldn't react, celebrations that made stadiums explode, commentators shouting his name like a god. Frank watched those images and felt like seeing a stranger. The man on TV was taller, stronger, faster, more alive, while he was just a man in his 40s with chronic back pain, swollen knees, a cracked heart, and an identity left on the field. Retirement didn't free him. It made him realize baseball was the only place that made him feel valuable. Without it, he had to learn to live from scratch, as a bare human, no titles, no cheers, no the big hurt. And learning to live with that emptiness was his new battle. A battle with no fans, no coaches, no scoreboard. A battle where every passing day he had to fight the most terrifying thing, silence. In the early years after retirement, Frank Thomas lived as if the world had sucked all sound out of his life. A man once used to earth-shaking cheers now faced evenings with only the tick-tock of the clock and pain running down his spine. He relearned walking, relearned breathing, relearned believing in his own worth once tied to a baseball bat and tens of thousands of fans. But then, as old age began to shadow his body and his left foot still throbbed every morning, a small gentle light appeared where he least expected, his new family. Frank met the woman who let him not be the big hurt, didn't need him to be strong, didn't need him to appear unyielding. With her he was allowed to be weak, allowed to set the burden down, allowed to breathe like a normal person. Second love came to him quietly, not dazzling like MLB lights, but softly like an evening song, silent yet full of redemption. Frank once thought his heart had frozen forever after losses, misunderstandings, years of loneliness. But the new love didn't try to break the ice, it just patiently warmed it, like winter sun through a frosty window. When he married the second time, it wasn't an attempt to fill a void, but a decision born from true peace. And then the children came like gifts life finally decided to give him. The first time Frank heard someone call him Dad, his heart shattered, but in the way that brings tears of overwhelming happiness. The child hugged his neck, tiny arms around the giant man, and Frank felt something no MLB title ever gave, belonging. Years ago he'd run up to the MVP podium with a Warrior's pride, but the moment his child ran to hug him just for walking through the door, that moment choked him in a way stadium lights never could. The kids helped him rediscover what he thought he'd lost, the ability to love and be loved, not for achievements, but for who he was as a person. They didn't care how many home runs he had, didn't care who he was with the White Sox. To them he was just Dad, the storyteller at bedtime, the playmate in the backyard, the one who carried them on his shoulders even when his back hurt so much he wanted to collapse. Frank learned to love himself through his children's eyes. He realized his value never lay in arm strength or stats, but in being a support for others. Family dinners, laughter echoing in the house, mornings making milk for the kids, all soothed the soul parts torn by time and pain. But his happiness wasn't complete in the way others saw. Because in every warm moment, behind the joy, the old shadow of Pamela always lingered. The little sister he lost when he was too young to understand death, but old enough to never forget the pain. When he hugged his kids, sometimes he glimpsed Pamela's face from long ago. When he heard his daughter's laughter, his heart tightened for a few seconds as he wondered, if Pamela were alive, would she have laughed like that? In every happiness of Frank's, There was always a slight tremble, a bit of fear, a touch of fragility. That fear of loss wasn't weakness. It was the scar from childhood, the scar he'd carried his whole life. And even as he smiled, loved, lived in new joy, the deepest part of his heart still remembered, loss can come any time. But instead of letting that fear hold him back, Frank used it to love his current family more, deeper, fuller. He knew life guarantees nothing. That's why he chose to cherish every moment. He learned to be home more, listen more, temporarily forget past glory to live for the present. The new family didn't erase old wounds, but it turned them into lessons. It made him understand that even those who've endured the greatest pains can still find light. And sometimes, that light doesn't come from stadiums, titles, or millions recognizing you. It comes from a small hand holding your finger, from the morning call of daddy, from the feeling of being needed, not because you're the big hurt, but because you're Frank. For someone who'd lived in darkness too long, that light was the greatest miracle life ever sent. The new family happiness helped warm Frank's heart again, but time, the enemy that never sleeps, still crept forward day by day. And one morning, as he got out of bed, a numbing chill ran from his heel up his back, forcing him to brace against the wall just to stand straight. That was the first moment Frank realized time spares no one, not even legends who once shook all of MLB. His body began to weaken in a way not sudden like injury, but slow and smoldering like groundwater. Vision declined. He had to squint to read the morning paper, then moved to wearing glasses, then couldn't see clearly without good light. Some days while playing with the kids, the ball flew high, but his eyes blinked repeatedly to track its fall. Frank smiled so the children wouldn't worry, but inside a soft panic rose. What if one day I can't see my kids anymore? His heart no longer beat with the vigor of youth. Evenings climbing stairs, he'd pause to catch his breath. Mornings waking up, he heard each heavy beat like distant drums. Doctors said it was the natural result of decades of overexertion, but to Frank it wasn't natural. It was a reminder that every weakening beat was a step away from his strongest self. The joints, especially knees and back, now like hinges used too long, they cracked every time he bent to pick up toys for the kids. On cold rainy days, he'd rub his legs for 10 minutes before stepping out. Some nights lying down, his lower back hurt so much he'd toss and turn constantly, like searching for a position to ease the memories of youth. His body had once been the perfect weapon, now it was a painful diary of his entire career. Then one evening, Frank stood in front of the bathroom mirror, the light cast down, revealing every wrinkle, every dark circle, every gray strand mixed with black. His chest no longer steel hard, his stomach a bit softer, shoulders no longer upright like a bronze statue. He stared into the mirror so long that steam rose and gradually blurred the reflection, and in that moment he whispered, "Is this me, the man who once shook all of MLB?" No one heard that question, only the mirror and the shadow of old age, staring back with eyes sad enough to choke. Old age doesn't come with roars, it comes with silence. It comes when fans call his name less, when media mentions him sparingly, when his highlight clips are only replayed at the start of new seasons, when he appears at the stadium. Some young fans don't immediately recognize who he is. For someone who was once the center of light, fading from public memory is a special kind of loneliness, the kind that leaves the chest empty like an abandoned room. Frank didn't say this to his wife, not to his kids, not to friends. But inside, a quiet fear arose, fear of being forgotten, fear no one remembers, the big hurt, fear of himself dissolving from the world like sand slipping through fingers. Some nights, he sat alone in his study, soft yellow light, looking at old photos, young Frank raising his bat in celebration, Frank signing autographs for long lines of fans, Frank hugging teammates after a game-deciding home run. He touched each photo, feeling like touching a different man, a stronger version that time was taking away piece by piece. But the scariest thing wasn't the aging body, not the fatigue, not the fading spotlight. The scariest was feeling he was losing himself, the man who once knew exactly who he was, where he stood, where he belonged. Old age, for Frank Thomas, wasn't just physical decline, it was the final challenge of the spirit, a fight between memory and present, between glory and quiet, between who he once was and who he had to become. And that was the quietest pain in a legend's life, not being knocked down, but having time take pieces of him, slowly, irresistibly. Old age came to Frank Thomas not with thunder, but with a whisper, quietly, without noise, but seeping into every corner of his life. And after years wrestling with physical pain and fear of losing himself, Frank entered his twilight with something he'd never known how to do his whole life: acceptance. Not surrender, but acceptance that life isn't just about fighting, but also moments to live slowly, lightly, peacefully. Frank spent more time at home. He spent mornings driving the kids to school, afternoons watching them play ball, moments he'd always missed before because of stadiums and flights. He understood his children's childhood wouldn't last forever, and he wanted to be there for every second, every smile, every run. Some afternoons he sat on the back porch steps, watching his daughter jump rope and his son mess with a ball, his heart softening in a way no MVP ever could. Frank also embarked on charity work, partly to give back, partly to keep Pamela, the little sister taken too soon, alive in every action. He donated to leukemia research funds, visited hospitals, talked with children fighting the disease that stole Pamela. Each time he held a tiny girl's hand on a hospital bed, eyes dazed but still trying to smile, Frank felt his heart tighten. He never said it, but everyone understood. It was his way of telling Pamela he was still here, still remembering, that the old wound wasn't meaningless. His public appearances grew rare. No more long interviews, no more baseball analysis on TV, no more surprise cameos exploding crowds. Frank chose the background, chose quiet over noise, chose peace over lights. And when he occasionally appeared at big MLB events, fans often noticed his smile was different, still warm, still kind, but with a beautiful sadness, as if in every smile were decades of ups and downs, glory, loneliness, loss, and finally forgiveness. Once a reporter asked why he seemed gentler, softer than in his playing days. Frank just smiled faintly. "I've been through too much to be the same as before." That wasn't a complaint. It was the summary of a lifetime. A life of running, fighting, overcoming, enduring, until it was enough. And he learned to stop. His body wasn't as strong, his back ached with weather changes, his eyes blurred on small print sometimes, but his heart, the heart that once carried so many cracks, now knew softness, knew how to love the simple things he'd missed. Frank no longer chased fame. Fame to him now was just an echo of a past era. He didn't need anyone to call him the Big Hurt. He didn't need reminders of MVPs, the Hall of Fame, home runs that terrified pitchers. He'd been through it all, stood at the highest point, touched glory not every athlete reaches. But today, that glory wasn't something he clung to. What he pursued now was peace. Peace sitting on the sofa watching TV with his wife. Peace napping to the sound of children's laughter. Peace walking slowly in the park, no one recognizing the legend. Peace knowing he didn't need to run anymore, didn't need to prove anything anymore, didn't need to fight the world anymore. Twilight turned Frank Thomas into a quieter but more emotional man than ever. One who once wore pain like armor, now knew how to take it off. One misunderstood, now knew forgiveness. One who lived in blazing light, now learned to live in the gentle glow of sunset. And in that sunset, after a lifetime of endurance, fighting, and loss, Frank finally found what he'd searched for so long: peace in his own heart. Frank Thomas's twilight years passed in the peace he had traded for with a lifetime of endurance. But looking back on his journey, a long path like a road across America, full of high mountains, deep valleys, storms, and eerie silences, Frank understood that his life was never the story of an athlete. It was the story of a man fighting against fate, against loss, against loneliness and darkness, deeper than any locker room had ever witnessed. Frank Thomas was not born into luxury, not into the paradise of talented children. He was born into a hard-working family, where size outnumbered laughter, where the death of little Pamela, his sister, put an end to a childhood that was already far from complete. He grew up haunted by hospital memories like ghosts, with his mother's choked sobs following him into adulthood. That pain never vanished, it just slept quietly in his heart, waiting for weak moments to sting like an old knife. Then he entered young adulthood with a burning NFL dream. He believed it was the path to escape, the way out of sadness, proof that he was good enough, strong enough, worthy enough to overcome the past. But fate, as if too accustomed to pushing him down, led him to an NFL draft day where his name was never called. Friends celebrated, the TV blazed, but Frank sat alone, hands trembling, feeling like the world had rejected him once again. From that darkness, he turned to baseball, not because it was the ideal choice, but because it was the only one that didn't turn its back on him. And in the sport few believed he could succeed in, Frank Thomas became an MLB monster, became the man the entire city of Chicago feared losing, became the big hurt, not just for the power that shattered pitchers' throws, but because his heart carried too many wounds that never healed. He won MVP, not once, but twice in a row. He became a legend in the steroid era, a time when truth was distorted, and those who did right paid with ultimate loneliness. Frank never took a single steroid dose, and that very fact made him out of place in his own generation. People mocked him for being too moral, but he stood firm. Integrity was never the easy choice, but it was the only one he knew. But even gods on the field can't beat fate. The 2004 injury crushed not just his foot bones, but crushed the dream of lifting the championship trophy with the White Sox. And in 2005, when Chicago reached the pinnacle after nearly 90 years of waiting, Frank Thomas, the soul of the entire team, could only sit alone in his living room, foot iced, watching his teammates celebrate on the TV screen. That was the moment fate closed the door on the most beautiful part of his life. The moment his heart shattered again, this time so deeply, he knew it would never fully heal. Many would collapse here, but Frank Thomas didn't fall. He returned in 2006, like a phoenix from the ashes, hitting 39 home runs at an age when many had already hung up their gloves. But he knew the truth. This wasn't permanent revival. It was a final farewell, one last parade for a life that had fought too much. Then he retired. The lights went out. The cheers vanished. Friends drifted away. His body collapsed day by day. His identity, the one tied to baseball his whole life, slipped from his hands like falling sand. He faced a new darkness, silence. But once again, Frank found life from within the wounds themselves. He built a new family. He held his children close, heard them call him Dad, and felt his heart frozen for so many years begin to warm again. He loved himself again through the way others loved him, not for fame, but for the real man he was. He helped children with leukemia as a way to keep Pamela, the little girl who shaped his entire life, alive in every act of kindness. And entering his twilight, he became a gentler, deeper, quieter man. His smile carried a beautiful sadness. I've been through too much to be the same as before. That wasn't fatigue. It was experience, understanding, acceptance. And then, looking back on a long life, we see the most admirable thing about Frank Thomas wasn't the 521 home runs, the 2 MVPs, the thunderous swings, but his ability to survive childhood loss, survive NFL rejection, survive an MLB full of lies, survive the fateful foot fracture, survive post-retirement loneliness. Frank Thomas wasn't great just for his power. He was great because he carried a lifetime of wounds on his back, and still stood tall. Glory will fade. The body will age. The name will gradually dim with time. But integrity, resilience, unyielding spirit, those no one can take away, no time can erase. And that is Frank Thomas's true legacy. Not a monument built from stats, but a life built from suffering, integrity, and unbreakable will. If you look at his life and see yourself somewhere, the unseen wounds, the rejections, the broken dreams, remember, greatness isn't in never falling. Greatness is in rising no matter how many times you fall. Think about your own life. What are you fighting? What pain are you trying to rise from? Have you forgiven yourself yet? Because in the end, as Frank Thomas taught us, a person's greatest legacy isn't in the light they create, but in the darkness they've walked through. Frank Thomas's life, when viewed from beginning to end, isn't just the journey of a great athlete, but a mirror reflecting the deepest wounds a person can carry through life. Reading each part of the story again, we can't help but feel a choking sorrow, from a childhood haunted by Pamela's death, the sister he loved more than anything, to the NFL draft day that abandoned him, leaving him sitting alone in an empty room, hands shaking from feeling not good enough. Those were the moments that shaped the heart of a man who seemed invincible, even when he reached MLB's pinnacle, with 2 MVP titles, and the nickname the Big Hurt. We understand that behind the thunderous swings was a soul quietly carrying loneliness, misunderstood by the media, envied by teammates, and pursued by darkness from a past never fully healed. The most painful scene is perhaps 2005, when the White Sox won it all without him. Frank sitting alone in his living room, foot iced, watching teammates celebrate on TV. That was the symbol of life's occasional cruelty toward those who've given their whole heart. And then, as old age arrived, body failing, fame fading, Frank faced his greatest fear, fear of being forgotten, fear of losing himself. But what makes this story beautiful and haunting is how Frank rose from it all. He found peace in his new family, in the call of Dad, in charity work to remember Pamela, in the gentle acceptance Twilight granted. The lesson for Americans isn't just honoring success, but honoring resilience in suffering, honoring those who live true, and understanding that glory can fade, but integrity, the thing Frank kept to the end, is the true legacy. If Frank Thomas's journey, full of pain yet unyielding, touches you, please subscribe to join us in the next stories about truly great people. Thank you for following along. See you in the next video, where we continue exploring legacies built from pain, integrity, and extraordinary resilience.